2021 to order. The first item on our agenda is the minutes of our previous two meetings, 4/27 of 21 and 5/11 of 21, copies of which are in the packets. Any corrections or revisions to the minutes necessary? If not, I'll take a motion to approve both sets of minutes. Motion by Herbst, is there a second? Second by Watson. Further discussion? Seeing none, members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? None are opposed, so both sets of minutes are approved. Item number 2 is discussion and possible action regarding pet license late fees. And this is one item, we had a couple items that we had to hold off last time because we ran out of time. This is the first one. And so we have actually had this, we have the city attorney with us on WebEx. She has been doing a little bit of research about pet late fees. You'll recall that in 2013, I believe, we had increased the late fees for late licensing of pets if they were not licensed by April 1st. And at that point, we substantially increased the late fee as a penalty for that lateness. At the time when those changes were made, we had a subcommittee that was studying, a subcommittee of public health and safety was studying pet issues citywide. And some of the results of that committee were that we had created the Humane Officer Program, we hired her, we did a lot of different pet ordinances, we created pet fancier permits, we did all kinds of changes involving the behavior of pet owners and pet ownership. And so this fee thing is just one of the things that came out of there. But at the time, the city was experiencing pet licensing compliance, something at like 10%. It was ridiculously low. And so using a carrot and stick approach, they recommended that we increase the license fee, but then give a credit for microchipping, spay and neuter, which we want people to do to control the population, and that's been working actually. But then as an incentive for people to get licensed on time every year, that we raise the penalty as well. And so there's been some discussion of that because this year, as the police department and the clerk's office together are trying to enforce now on the late ones since April 1st has come and gone, it's time to either make sure people get compliant or issue citations by our rules. And so that has brought a request from both departments that we consider a reduction in that late fee because it really is a hindrance, first, based on the pandemic situation with some people's finances, but second, it really has resulted in lacking compliance once people are so far across the line that it's going to cost them hundreds of dollars to license this pet. A lot of people will opt to violate and continue to wait until the following year. And so the compliance that we thought we were getting isn't always coming. But I'll go to Ann for a second to talk about the late fee in general, because I think she's been trying to research some statutes and determine what we should do with this late fee. Are you on, Ann? Oh, there she is.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a rather legal sounding page-and-a-half memo in the packet, and I know Marianne had conducted a search of other communities, but 10 of those 15 looked to me like they had late fees of $5. But when I researched the statutes and the matter how this came to be, at one point they were in the ordinance, and it was in our ordinance at $5. And it was in 2012 that we agreed to double that license fee. And I don't know if that was a suggestion at a Public Health and Safety Committee meeting, but Tara pointed out to me that she'd been here about 5 to 6 months. So perhaps we didn't do the research to check on whether there were any restrictions on the late fee at that time. So it has been in effect for quite a while. But when I went back to look at 174.05, it clearly says that if we want to charge a late fee, we have to put that in our ordinance that we will require payment of a late fee. But then it says the collecting official shall assess and collect a late fee of $5. Where it allows us, it sets a minimum dog license tax and allows municipalities to raise that tax. The legislature did not see fit to set a minimum late fee, thereby giving cities the ability to raise that. So interpreting that statute, I believe that we cannot charge any more than $5 for a late fee. So my recommendation would be to change that late fee on the schedule back to $5. And if the current licensing fees or the license tax doesn't cover the costs of running the program, then that would have to be agendized on a future agenda, and maybe the license taxes could be reviewed, but I think the late fee has to be reduced back down to $5.
Okay, thank you for that. So under the statute, then, we could set the license fee at whatever level the council's willing to approve, but the late fee is really the only problematic part at this point?
Yes.
Okay. And so we certainly, as we come, usually what we do is every couple of years, towards the end of the year, I mean, we start charging for dog licenses in December. So usually in the fall, we kind of take a look at that and see, if we are keeping up with other communities, other neighboring communities, and, where we're at for our fee. And I think it was just last year, maybe we had decided to raise that fee like $2. So we certainly can give that another look and see where we're at between the cost of the program and see if we need to adjust the core licensing fee. But what did you find, Mary Ann, with your research on pet licensing in other areas? Were a bunch of them charging way more than the 5? They're probably maybe also wrong with theirs, so.
Yeah, and that was, I think in the last packet I think I'd done a research of maybe 10 to 12 communities, and there was, when we went through this revamping our pet licensing, some of the council members had kind of tried to collaborate with other communities in the area, and so Weston actually has a fee schedule that looks very much like our fee schedule, so they have penalties, double the license fee. But I think like La Crosse, my recollection is La Crosse's was about $20, their late fee. And none of the communities had a late fee as high as we did.
Right.
So if we would want to convert back, I guess we would recommend that we refund those people that we've collected for this
year.
licensing year.
That's
which
fair.
is about $14,000 in revenues that we would be returning, so,
Okay.
yeah.
There's a lot of non-compliance and there's a lot of lateness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, as Ann points out, the program doesn't pay for itself. And if we could increase participation in the program, the license fees could stay reasonable. But it's just getting people to license. And I think, we appreciate the fact that the police department is stepping up their enforcement, because we have seen a decrease in compliance over the last couple of years once they stopped doing enforcement.
Right, that's the key thing, and I think that's one thing that came out of the task force, or not task force, but subcommittee a number of years ago, was what process did we have in place to follow up? And one of the things that we amended was that we asked vet clinics first to send us notice of rabies vaccinations when they were giving them to their, pet patients, and so then at that point, we would have the humane officer say, go back to those folks who we knew had vaccinated a pet but did not hold a license and say, hey, we see you vaccinated, your pet, thank you for doing that, now it's time for your license. And that was a time-intensive process, but it was very effective. The other thing that she was getting was, and may still be getting, was reports from the Humane Society when they would adopt out pets. So she would be able to send out a letter saying, congratulations, you got a new pet, it's time for your license. We have never been able to get the shelter to sell our license. That really would solve a lot of things. We, at one point, talked about trying to make our dog license available either through local pet shops that are in the city, because now you can pay for it online. They don't have to handle our cash anymore. We also thought about maybe seeing if we could get the shelter to sell them for us, because it's as easy as bringing it up on a computer and, somebody swiped their credit card and it's gone. I mean, it's done. And, but all of those entities have been unwilling to address the dog license. So the communities are left with following up on the license after the pet has gone home with a new owner. Sarah?
So what is compliance this year anyway? I mean,
What's the compliance rate?
yeah, so is it 10% this year too, or?
I should hope we're not back to that low.
No, I would say that at our highest was probably maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and we have seen a decline. Like, I would bet we're selling anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 less licenses than we were when we were at our highest. But, to Lisa's point, it is pretty convenient to license your pet, because they get an invoice, and if it's a renewal, they get an invoice in the mail. They get reminder notices. They can do it online. We have 2 pet clinics a year. So it isn't, I
It's
don't
easier
think.
than it's ever been. You used to have to bring your paperwork and used to physically have to come to City Hall during business hours to get that license. And now it's far easier than that.
I have to say it's a little putty online. I've
Yeah,
tried it a couple
it's-
times, but you have to create an account, and then if you have like a dog on there, you have to figure out if you can delete the dog. And
Sure.
it is a little, I mean,
It's
and
not.
I'm pretty tech savvy, and I'm just like, so I don't know if there's a better way of doing it online. You
Yeah.
know, hey,
That's something we can look at. You know, at one
Yeah.
point, we started out with a very expensive service that we and Weston were working together on called Pet Data, and it was pretty user-friendly. And so we took that though in-house and saved a whole bunch of money by taking that in-house and running it through our own systems after we got some new licensing software. So maybe, if it could be simplified, I don't know. The city of Wausau also has for years had an app. People could probably bring up the website through the app and do it on their phones as well. But the fact that they don't have to take time out of their day and, you know, run down here and buy the license face-to-face anymore, that's been gone for probably 8+ years. And, you know, I think part of the reason we had such good compliance, you know, 4 or 5 years ago was because that enforcement was really vigilant. They were on top of it. And so, you know, when the April deadline came, by the end of May, you know, they were out, you know, telling pet owners, hey, you've missed the deadline, here's your citation. And, you know, while that doesn't, you know, our goal is not to be an unfriendly community to pets, but you still have to promote quality, responsible pet ownership, and getting that rabies vaccination, and the license actually helps get that pet back to the owner when it's lost. So I think, you know, people may not understand why they need a license and think that's just another, you know, charge that they maybe don't want to pay for, but at the end of the day, if that pet's lost and found, the license helps get them home again. Sarah?
is there a way to like change the system of instead of opting in, you have to opt out if you have a pet? You know, because then people would be more likely to pay it if they were already on some kind of roller roster instead of having to do an extra step.
Well, so they are on a roster because anyone who licensed 1 year automatically, like, is set up into the system for the next year. The system sort of rolls everybody forward, and that's why they get an invoice in the mail, is because now they're in the system. They just need to pay it. And of course, the other thing is you have to update your vaccine information.
Sure.
Because you have to have your rabies vaccination. And that, you know, because generally, once you get a pet, and if they're spayed or neutered, you're kind of set then. It's just that every other year or every 3 years, getting your rabies vaccination updated in the system. Otherwise, it would be
Right.
simple.
And there's always pets that fly under the radar and are not ever found or noticed until there's a problem. So until they get away, until they're found loose, until they bite somebody, that's
Where
when
they
they
go to.
often get found, because in a house that's never licensed a pet that goes and gets one, there's no way that you're gonna know that pet is there, especially if they've also failed to vaccinate, because then there's a disconnect between the vaccine notice and the license. So there's no way to follow up unless you would stumble upon the fact that maybe you get a complaint from a neighbor or something, and then Ashley would find them that way. But there are always going to be in our midst pets that are flying under the radar that have not done any of it and have not caused any trouble, so they've not been found. But the vast majority, you know, we want to get compliance out of that group. Dawn?
I have a question for Mary Ann. I think this is wonderful that you plan on perhaps returning $14,000 to the people. But do you think that there could be a problem in the future where they say, well, gee, we didn't, we paid this money, but they gave it back to us, let's do it again, what the heck? You know, you think there'll be a problem in the future like that again?
I don't know, and I guess I would, you know, confer with the city attorney about if we know our late fee was excessive, and then we adjust it if we are almost obligated. We're not going to, of course, return the license fee, just the late fee.
And if that person has also received a citation for failure to license, that isn't coming back, because the penalty
Right.
part isn't a problem. It's just the late fee. So in many cases, when you went past the deadline, you not only paid for the license, the penalty, but you also got a ticket for not licensing. The ticket isn't going back. So, you know, those two pieces were like $187 a piece. And so one of them would come back, but we're not going to forgive the tickets if they've issued the tickets. Right? I mean, that's kind of, Sarah?
Right.
Can I make a motion to reduce the late fee to $5?
Certainly.
And
Okay.
reimburse those that have already paid the late fee this year,
Sure.
that overage.
So we have a motion by Watson to reduce the fee to $5 and refund the excessive late fee to those who have paid it in 2021. Deb, is that a second? And a second by Ryan. Further discussion? Seeing none, members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? None are opposed, that motion carries. Let's see here. So then item number 3 is the other item we held from last month,
Yep.
which is discussion and possible action regarding the February 2021 general fund financial statements.
Yep, so I know it's early in the year, just for informational too, the auditors are here, so we should be getting our final reports wrapped up very soon. Things started out in 2021 very well. From a revenue standpoint, we are seeing a little bit of a lag, still kind of COVID-related, related to fewer citations. Some of our public charges are down, as well as investment income. But we're also seeing a similar trend in our expenses, mainly due to the very mild winter. You know, 2020 was a mild winter, but 2021 was even milder. So, you know, when we compare our expenses for winter-related DPW 2020 to 2021, through the first 2 months, we were down about $500,000. So I think that is going to really help us. Obviously, March was mild, April was mild, and then we have fourth quarter always to concern ourselves with. But it's looking like 2021 in the general fund, we should have, you know, things going our way. Yeah.
Hope for another mild winter, and maybe
Yes.
that, we can actually build that up a little bit, because sometimes if you get the winter from heck that we had a few years ago, we were so far behind, we had to infuse the
Yeah.
salt budget a couple times to come out on that particular year. So that always can ebb and flow, but it's good to be ahead of it a little bit. Questions on the February report at all? If none, we'll place it on file. Item number 4 is discussion and possible action on approving the 2021 Community Development Block Grant Program allocation for an updated allocation. And we do have Tammy Strotz with us on WebEx. You'll see, based on the materials in the packets, that once the funds were actually awarded, we did receive a small amount extra beyond what they were expecting. And so it looks like they are proposing to add that little bit to a road construction project, because most of those construction activities have, everything has this year shown itself to be more expensive than people figured. Tammy, do you have anything to add on the block grant, on that little extra?
No, Lisa, I think you did a very good job of reading my mind.
Well, not your mind, your memo. So your supplemental or your materials in the packet were fantastic. So does anyone have questions for Tammy on that at all? Deb, go ahead.
Tammy, you may not be aware of, but for SISM, we had looked at the road construction for Fifth Avenue that's being done at this time, and residents in the area went around and had a petition and brought that to our meeting this month. And I'm wondering, could we add the additional cost for putting mid-block LED lights and new WPS pole, as well as the electrical, which is at the corner, as part of that? I would think that this is a lower income neighborhood. It may not be considered blight by HUD standards, but I think the homes in this area are probably 80 or under 100,000.
You're talking on Fifth Avenue where they're,
Yes.
We actually, the residents had petitioned for some added street light, and so rather than put in any sort of decorative light or anything like that, we requested that the staff go to Pub Service, find out if there's an existing pole that an extra light could be placed on mid-block to increase the light at that point. They're just right at the threshold where more light might be necessary. And so the city engineer had indicated in that meeting that there is not a pole there, but they could install one. at a strategically placed location that would get the light where it needs to go. It is nowhere near, though, the thousands and thousands of dollars that we see with projects that have decorative lighting, where it's, $85,000. He figured that that would be a nominal cost. And, we had asked him if that project would stay on track, if we had him get costs and come back next month, and then we approved it at the following meeting. And he stated the project would be in and out so quickly that he couldn't guarantee that. So the committee had authorized him to pursue that installation of that pole and that mid-block light with pub service, and he did expect that it was possible. They had enough, perhaps, contingency built into the project that it wouldn't be so expensive that we would need a budget mod anyway. So I don't know that we would necessarily need grant funding, but, he was working on that as of a week or two ago.
I wanted to also mention, I got a call from a neighbor, so I walked over there through the sand piles, and yes, there is no poles mid-block at this point. So it would be something that I would think would be going over their expected costs, because we're talking like 2 to 3 blocks where you would put in a new wood pole, plus all the, the wiring from the corners to light that, and then LED light.
Okay. So with that,
So is that something legal, Tammy, for this community development block grant funds or not?
Not at this point, we couldn't do it because we did our whole allocation program for the year. If it's something that would come up, we would have to go make another request. And with the low-level lights, like Lisa said, the last time we did a project on 7th Street, it cost $270,000. So we obviously don't have that kind of funding, additional funding to do.
But Tammy, they didn't ask for that. All they're asking for is a light on a wood pole for the
Yeah.
mid-block. So we're not talking about any special upgrade of all the lights on the 2 to 3 block area.
but we're outside
Okay.
the approval window, right? See, we had that trouble with Scott Street. When we tried to do them from 6th to 10th on Scott Street, we ended up having to put in the bases and then wait a year for the lights to go in because of the grant funding window, to spend the money down, right? Because
That's
if you're,
correct.
if
Yep,
you're
yes.
already in progress, you can't use those funds. Is that, you have to plan for that on the front end? You don't take a
Correct.
project that's in progress and then quick add grant money?
Right, we wouldn't be able to now change where these fundings are gonna go without doing a whole new public hearing and, find, all the steps that would take us months before we submit it to HUD. And then where would we get the money from? We're getting an extra $9,000, but would that cover this cost? And in order to do another project, it would take us a couple of months to get the public hearings involved and before we could bring it to finance and council. And our clock is ticking to get our funding, get this approval taken care of so we can get the money, so we can get it out the door.
So, and the committee had already requested that the engineering team look for project savings in other areas to perhaps fund it with, so that we wouldn't have to wait on it, because they're already in the ground on the project, so they need to get it done. So, I think maybe, well, it's a good idea to have grant funds, that, maybe this is not the one. So we're too late, really.
I guess I have a question for Tammy. For way back when, 2000, 2005, a similar thing came up under Ann Worth's administration, where they wanted to put in a neighborhood officer and take out $25,000 in funding for rent assistance. The agencies, including myself, advocated, and the United Way director, about reallocating that funds, and that was done at the city council. So why is this not legal as well?
I guess I'm not familiar enough with what program you're talking about. Yes, we did a neighborhood officer, but we did that through the regular process of when we funded them for, it was called an officer in the neighborhood, I think, for a couple of years. but we didn't do it midway.
Well, the council, I think when, maybe that was part of the initial block grant approval process. So in this case, we're just approving an amendment to add extra money. But
Correct.
had we rewound a few months when we were in our initial block grant approval based on the recommendations of the citizen panel, at that point, the citizen panel makes a recommendation for how that money should be divided up, and the council can adjust that on the council floor. So if they wanted to take in, they normally don't go against the recommendation of the panel, but they could decide that they wanted a little more in blight or a little more in sidewalk projects or whatever it is. They can make those adjustments before they do that first ratification, right?
Correct, and you also, they also have to make an application. So for city council to say, you know, hey, I want to do whatever project, but they've never made an application for the funding, it's pretty hard for us to approve it because, one, we don't even know if that project would meet block grant eligibility, and where are you going to take the money from a different pot? You know, we'd have to play with it. And without them making a formal application, it doesn't meet our guidelines, and you could get in trouble with HUD from deviating from that.
I do recall that is the case, that it was something North Central Community Action did put in the request for 25,000, but it was denied, so to get a neighborhood officer. But again, for the poll, we didn't do a request, so that's the difference. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay.
Sure.
With that, do we have a motion to approve the allocation as recommended by staff? We have a motion by Ryan. Is there a second? Second by Herbst. Further discussion? Seeing none, members in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed? None are opposed, that motion carries. Item number 5 is discussion regarding the 2020 COVID election grant funding, including but not limited to the Wisconsin Election Commission and the Center for Tech and Civic Life. And so during the 2020 election, which was unlike any other, the city received grant funding from a couple sources to manage elections and make the election activity safer. And so we wanted to have a little discussion of that tonight. I'll let Mary Ann run over what they got in terms of grant funding, what they used it for. I know that there has been some, at least in social media circles, some chatter about one of those grants. And so we want to be clear on how that grant was used and how we came to be aware of and apply for that particular funding. So I'll turn over to Mary Ann.
Yep, so as you know, the presidential election is an expensive election to manage on a regular year and then add all of the complications of COVID really increased our expenses. We, through the Safer Election Commission, implemented the drive-up election, which was very popular, but it did, add to the cost of managing the elections. We received alert from the county clerk regarding the CTCL grant and encouraging all of the clerks to apply for that grant. And then we also received communications from the Election Commission regarding a grant that they were managing. And then we coordinated those expenses between those two activities, and then any other expenses that were COVID-related, we went to our routes to recovery to try to seek reimbursement there. So we really used 3 grant sources to help defray some of the election costs due to COVID. As Lisa said, the CTCL, which stands for what, Community?
Center for Tech and Civic Life or something?
Yes, has gotten quite a bit of publicity. I was attended via Zoom a League of Municipalities finance meeting, and I asked the finance directors on the call if anyone else had experienced any, I'll call it drama, regarding the grant, and they all laughed and said, oh yeah. So it has generated a lot of interest, at least in the state of Wisconsin. It did bring up a good point that Deb Ryan had, We today do not have a policy that requires grants come before commission or committee or council for approval. We have occasions where grants come before the council or finance committee for approval if there's a local share. Sometimes the grant itself will require council approval, or the grant might require a public hearing, similar to what we just were talking about with community development. I know the J grants that the police department receives also require a public hearing. So we talked about, well, maybe that is something that the city would like to contemplate, is for grants to come, before committee for approval prior to acceptance. And, I could certainly try to work on a policy like that. The one thing, in kind of thinking to myself, the pros and the cons, certainly it's an extra step for the departments. And oftentimes we're all, overworked or overstressed right now. And so we're always kind of finish things up at the last minute. And so I'm, would hate for us to not be able to submit a grant because we didn't have time to get it on a committee. Maybe it's at the acceptance rather than the application. That might be something that would be more helpful. We do have a policy today that says if we're going to take something other than a cash grant, so this came up right soon after I started working for the city, because Wausau School District got into a routine of giving the police department these old SUVs that they had, and they would have, over 100,000 miles on them. And then it was slowly increasing the number of vehicles that police had in their fleet, but then they would want to replace them right away because, well, it needed replacing. And so there was a cost associated with accepting it because we were increasing the fleet, and they were so old that there was a lot of maintenance issues. Another example would be, accepting, let's say, land as a donation. You would want to do your due diligence to make sure it wasn't polluted and, to make sure that it stayed within the vision of the city. So that would be another example that our policy would come into effect. But we could certainly, put together something. You always want to try to balance the management of the process to what you're trying to achieve. But, to Deb's point, it's good to know about the grants, and we get a lot of grants that don't come before committee or council for approval. And so it definitely could be a very positive.
To me, it
yes.
seems like receiving grant funding is a positive, and I think there's a lot of those positives where if we're getting grant funding, it's important too that the public be able, at least the ones that watch our meetings, be able to know that we have fund sources that are not just debt and levy. And so I think for anyone that thinks that we spend our days taxing them to death, also realize though that we have a lot of, income that we receive from grant sources that are a real positive, because often that allows us to either provide services we couldn't provide without them. Like a lot of times the police department will get a grant for overtime for speed enforcement. Well, perfect, because we have complaints about that stuff on a daily basis. So I think I do think though that coming to us for the approval end versus the application end, I don't want us to be responsible for missing a window. And so often that happens where some of those windows only open up once in 2 years. But I do think it's important for us to talk about, with the commentary that we've received surrounding the CTCL grant, I think it's important for people to recognize that we are not the only committee or community that applied for it, and that we applied for it at the behest of County Clerk Kim Trueblood. So, the fact that she had recommended to a number of municipalities that were experiencing these tremendous costs, hey, there's money out there, get your application in, and then let me know when you got it, because we had machines and things to order. I think it's important that people understand that, Wausau is not the only community that, even on a nationwide, statewide level,
Right.
that received grant funding for help in a situation where we were really facing an uphill battle with elections. Sarah?
I mean, I agree. I don't want it to be like an extra hurdle. But I think maybe it's just more like an educational item. Like we got this we've got this money, right? That we can now use for these capacities. It is just making people aware of that.
Sure. It
So-
increases your
Yeah,
transparency
as long as
too.
there's not like like something that we have to, budget mod for, there's not like the buy-in. I think it would be good just as educational pieces.
As a committee, though, would you want to approve them case by case for the recipient, for the acceptance of the grant? Or would you rather receive some of those where there's no local match? Would you want to receive them as part of a monthly report? Like you're already getting monthly reports on income and expense. Would a section of that report that says, hey, this month we received 2 grants for these items, is that information enough? Or do we want to have complete and total control over all acceptance? Because some of that stuff is not even financial. Some of the things that they're getting grants for, I guess, overtime for enforcement is, but indirectly so. Same thing with seatbelt enforcement and stuff like that. So OWI patrols, they have a lot of that grant funding that they get, that way too. So, Deb?
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Well, part of this was that there was an inquiry by one of our residents that his wife was formerly on the city council, and that this center might have been considered a separate involvement with Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. And it was being looked at as something potentially democratic and maybe as a way to influence or change the election for Trump. So we did approve increase in the budget. So to be able to go ahead and fund the balance of it. So at a certain point, we could have said, okay, it's too controversial. We don't want to do that. We've already designated funds to handle it. And so to be impartial, we'll return the funds, and so to be done with it. So at a certain point, and I guess I think it's more at when you do have the receipt and that you've decided that you are going to follow the rules to use the grant in a certain way, and could be in separate funding as such. That's a good time to know and then decide whether this is something we can do or not. That I understand the other department heads are going ahead and applying for it. But in this instance, we already had the approved revised budget that would have covered all of these costs, and that we do have some neighbors that were really concerned that we should not have accepted these funds at all, and that it was inappropriate, and that we as a finance and council were not aware of it. So I think that's quite a bit of the issue.
I would say, looked back, our monthly financial reports did disclose specifically that we had received the grant, and it did identify the grant name. So it wasn't as if it wasn't disclosed. It was, written right on the narrative of the monthly budget report. If it was disclosed.
Well, and the other challenge we have, I think, as finance committee members or council members in general, is that once we are aware that we're receiving grant funds from any source, it is normally not incumbent upon us to have to dig through whatever information is available online, and not just in the meeting packets, because I won't call that a failure of our staff to report at all. What that is really is, how deep as a council person getting information are you going to dig to find out what the core source of the funds is? And, if a person or persons that you don't agree with have, donated to the funds that you're getting, how deep are you going to dig in between meetings to find out, the true source of that money? And so, I think the use is critical. Obviously, we used it to promote things like drive-in voting and make it easier for people to vote. And I think that, now we have this national narrative going on in many states where, there is an initiative to make it more cumbersome and difficult for people to vote. And I think at the end of the day, partisanship should not enter into that at all. Everybody should exercise their right to vote. That is a right that we all are given. And I think that making it a hassle to vote and making it difficult for people to vote, difficult to get to the polls, is just reprehensible. And so I think if we were, our Safe Election Task Force was willing to do whatever we needed to do to make it safe and easy for people to get to the polls and make their preferences heard. The drive-in voting for us was revolutionary. We'd never done it before, and it was wildly popular. So, on small elections, it's expensive, so you certainly wouldn't do it in small elections, but big ones, it's a fantastic option. Sarah?
I guess I was bummed I didn't get to do the drive-in voting. I volunteered, but I guess like I think without thinking of the the election funds. I mean, I think it would be good to have the approval come to council.
Okay.
Or whatever committee it's important, because then a citizen could weigh in on it during public comment
sure.
or email, and so that transparency is there. So if there are issues, they can come to the forefront and we can address them.
Yep. And I think, when you look at the list of expenses that we incurred with the 50,000, while some of them were spent on, like, COVID precautions that aren't lasting, meaning it was for cleaning, things like that, when you look, we were able to defray some costs that will help us for future elections by, investing in some equipment and things like that that will get benefits from for elections to come. And that, when you evaluate this, none of it looks like it would change, or was meant to manipulate the election. And then, certainly we didn't even know where the money came from. So there's no change in behaviors within the organization, because we didn't know about it until all the scuttlebutt, of recent of, where the funds came from.
Well,
So-
and I think you have an element of trust also in your county officials that supersede us in the election process and supervise all municipalities in the conducting of their elections. And when you get a memo from those folks that say, hey, there's money out there that's going to help all of you get your applications in, your instinct is to apply for the money and trust that, trust that source. So, I certainly don't think it was intentional, and I think that it's important, though, that, we've had this discussion, because like you say, it does have a lasting impact. I mean, if you've been able to purchase equipment and machines and all of those things. So, Sarah?
So is there any actionable item, like, Marion, you mentioned, like, creating a policy about approval of grants going forward?
Yep.
Item
I
6.
Yep, that's the next item.
sorry.
Item 6. We've actually kind of blended our discussion for 5 and 6, but, so 5 was informational because there was a lot of questions and I thought we needed to get out good answers. Item 6, though, discussion and possible action overview of our existing grant application process and management process for grants and future needs, also as it pertains to ARPA funds, which is American Rescue Plan. And we've been talking about that for a while. We've even had a public hearing about it to let people weigh in on what they'd like to see us do with those one-time large dollars. So, Mary Ann walked us through a little bit of where we were at with our existing grant process and where we want to go. But, if we wanted to direct her to create a policy that would bring the acceptance of grant funding of all types to us, they could be, if there's a lot of them, we could even batch them. If they're simple routine things like JAG grants and things that, they apply for and receive and use every single year. Sarah?
Are there any grants that would be more appropriately reviewed on different committees, or would it always just be finance?
I feel like incoming money is always our thing.
Okay.
I think the outcome, what they use it for matters to the other committees, but the fact that, we're managing their budgets and, any money that we take in to offset parts of that budget or augment their budget, I feel like that should happen here. I mean, that's our specialty.
Okay.
And a lot of the other committees are, very interested in the process and the outcome, but not always the nuts and bolts of the dollar part. That's kind of our thing.
The other thing, with the American Rescue Plan Fund, there, as we've discussed, there might be other pots of money available. So, being able to track some of the capital grants, that would be a positive for policy. The other thing that Lisa and I and the mayor talked about that we're kind of keeping an eye on is, we have grant application, right now, it's a decentralized thing. People try to squeeze it into their day, and no one is focused on that as a single item. And so today, at this point, there really isn't a good definition in the ARPA regulations of whether you could hire, let's say, a consultant or a part-time person to help manage grants or to help apply for grants. And so we're going to keep our eye on that and see if that's something that maybe would be financially feasible through that, and to see as a trial whether there would be value to the city of having a position like that, because, you know, that those individuals that do that have a special skill set, and when it is your sole focus, generally speaking, you're more successful than when you're balancing multiple things at one time.
That's one thing that we had talked about. Mayor Milky and I started a discussion late in 2019 about grants, and it was right after we had a discussion with Fire Chief Kujawa about aid to firefighter grants. I mean, she was proficient in writing those and wrote them, you know, almost annually, and was able to get a lot of CIP equipment and things funded that way for us. And, you know, one of our discussions that, you know, she had observed that the city does not employ a grant writer or a grant manager. And, you know, like Mary Ann said, that person does have a defined skill set, but, you know, what an asset it would be to all departments if we had someone whose job it was to search for those opportunities, who was effective at telling our story from any department perspective, you know, securing those funds and then tracking them to make sure that if there's reporting associated with them for the results and the use, or if there's, you know, renewals that need to happen, or make sure that they've met all the requirements at the end of the cycle, you know, and that job is, you know, at that point, he was thinking that was at least a half-time position, maybe a three-quarter-time position to get it started. We would obviously have to go to HR, they'd have to write a job description for that, figure out what it might cost, and then we have to figure out how to pay for it in one of our future budgets. But, you know, that, late in 2019, we were having that discussion, and, you know, he said, when we go to the 2020 budget in the spring, you know, I want to look at all of these things. Well, so right after that discussion, COVID happened, and then he didn't win. So he's gone. And I know that Mayor Rosenberg is also interested in finding a way for us to be really effective at grant writing, because there's so many varied skill sets in our different buildings, that if we had a central point, and that central point, with the amount of minutia involved, it can't be Mary Ann. Her plate's already full. But it certainly could be someone with an aptitude for finance and accounting and a reverence for the legal part of it that maybe works for her department. You know, if we could figure out the duties and the tasks, and then figure out what the market salary for it might be, then I think as we start to pull our budget together for next year, you know, we could figure out if we could at least start that. And if it turns out that it is successful, that person could conceivably bring in more money than they cost to employ. And at that point, that's a win for everybody. Sarah?
And I mean, I think I was going to mention the same thing. I mean, if you get enough grants and incoming revenue, that can lower, you know, the tax burden on taxpayers, and we get so many more services. And it's so much work to do to write grants. So I think it's amazing that the city staff does it in addition to their job. So I have to say kudos to you, because that has to be a pretty tough challenge. But yeah, if we could put I don't know, a pin in it and come back to it, because I think it's just as important as like the communications liaison, right, is this grant thing, so.
And I think there's other ways too, you know, you look at, let's say, the fundraising that is going on right now with the dog park. And, you know, when you look at the redevelopment of the mall and some of the planning, at least pre-planning that's taken place on what we call the South Riverfront, there's a lot of opportunities for private donations too for those. And so that person could also help us. I know when we were doing the River Park, you know, I was going out to all of the foundations trying to get them involved, and we did raise a lot of money for the Riverside Park through donations. But that would be another use for that position.
Right, and then there's a PR component to it also. People get to see that person's face, that person is associated with that activity. You know, and I think that, you know, there are grants of so many different types and stripes that we might miss. I mean, there's clean water grants. I mean, for the riverfront, we got EPA grants. Those are tough, and they're really competitive, but when you get one, you can make a big impact. You know, and so during the prior administration, those grants had kind of ground to a halt. There wasn't a lot of that money available going forward as these infrastructure bills are all circulating and, things, if some of that passes, there may be a whole bunch of new opportunities for us as a community. Sarah?
So would a motion be appropriate now or just direction to create a
Maybe what we
policy?
should do is we should vote to send a recommendation to the HR committee that they explore the creation of that position, explore what the salary band should be for it, and then report back to us on, what they envision the annual cost to be, so that when we start our budget discussions over the summer, that we have that kind of in the pocket. And that's one thing we could,
And can they look at like halftime and
Yes.
three-quarter time, like all the different
half,
times?
three-quarter, and full, I think we would probably want all three, so we can see that spectrum. Because if there isn't much difference between one and the other, chances are, from a financial and a PR standpoint, from fundraising, we can probably find activity to keep that person busy from three-quarter to full-time. The only difference is that full-time, you also come with a full benefits package, and your cost is way more, if that person takes them all. So I think that's, we'd have to analyze what the, where the step up is along the way, but I think I would love to have the HR department work on that for us, and, their committee can consider it also, and then we can get that information back. So, Deb?
I was just going to mention, is there maybe a way we could build it in as, under finance, but that maybe part of that position would involve economic development, keeping track of all the different contracts with developers and their timetables, so that there's a spreadsheet of when you're expecting, and so we can be ahead of the game at, following up with the different builders and what they're supposed to do for staffing, because it's kind of a financial and legal aspect of it.
So maybe not only tracking the grants we get, but tracking the grants we give for compliance. And that probably, those two things together probably make that a full-time job, because that is a huge task for somebody up in community development to keep track of whether people are on schedule or not. And, that makes that a big job. So I think we should look at it, with and without that responsibility, because they may have someone within the department that's already doing it that can keep doing it. But I certainly think we should get those pieces of information so that as we start to figure out what our 2022 budget looks like, if that's something we could afford, I think we would see a big benefit from that. So do we want to, let's vote on that. Does someone want to make a motion to recommend to the HR committee that they begin the study and the market analysis for a salary on a grant manager? Motion by Watson, is there a second? Second by Herbst. Further discussion? Seeing none, members in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None are opposed, that motion carries. So we'll ask
And then we'll
Mary Ann
bring
to
a
work with the
policy,
HR director
too.
on that.
For your consideration.
Sure.
Okay.
Perfect. That works. Item 7 is our last one, discussion and possible action authorizing the mayor to accept the city of Wausau's allocation from the U.S. Department of the Treasury Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. There's no local match required. So this is a vote from us to allow her to accept that big batch of money we have coming from the feds.
In the spirit of our great discussions, we
Is
thought,
that an
let's,
emphatic
Oh,
motion
yes,
from Watson?
please,
All right,
quickly.
motion by Watson. Is there a second? Second by Herbst. Further discussion or questions? Deb, go ahead.
Do we know specifically what we can do and can't do at this point, or is that going to be included in the letter when they send the check?
it will, we have some, what do they call it, initial
Early guidance or
draft
something. they
yeah,
had to know.
yes, but they are providing more guidance every day, and so, we basically are just kind of keeping track of information. I know there was a big release on non-entitlement communities either yesterday or even today. So we are kind of tracking that, and as soon as it's fully developed, we'll sit down and provide a informational session for council.
I think that's a good idea. Sarah?
And I found it really helpful, Mayor Rosenberg sent us that sort of email subscription thing to sign up for, and I've been getting them popping up in my inbox.
The one from the league?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. They're a
So,
little,
I've learned a lot about
Yes.
what can be included and not, so that might be a good thing for all of us to do.
well, and even their Capital Buzz newsletter, that's where we actually, as a committee, find out many times legislation that's circulating that directly affects us. And so when it's time for us to act, that's usually how we find out, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I guess I just want to give, I know a lot of people probably think I have like secret connections to the various administrations, but a lot of times it's through these email subscriptions that
I was
I'm
going to
getting
say,
the
there's times
insights.
we wish you did.
Yeah, and I can ask for follow-up from either, our senators or whatever, so.
Okay, that's
It's a really
perfect.
good thing to sign up for.
All right, so with a motion on the floor with a second to accept those federal funds, members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No one's opposed. That item is also approved. That is the last item on our agenda, so I will accept a motion to adjourn. Motion by Watson, second by Ryan. Members in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No one ever is. We'll stand adjourned. Common Council will start in here then at 6:30.